I can't waste my life struggling beside a man who will never become anything, my wife said as she zipped her designer suitcase shut and walked toward the front door of our apartment. I didn't stop her. I didn't beg. I just stood there in the kitchen holding a cold cup of coffee while the woman I had loved for 11 years left me for a millionaire old enough to be her father. 3 years later, Claire stood on my doorstep again, crying in the rain and asking for another chance. But by then, I was no longer the man she had abandoned. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end. And let me know where you're watching from, because sometimes the people who destroy your life end up teaching you exactly how strong you really are. The apartment felt strangely quiet after Claire left. Not peaceful, hollow, like the walls themselves had realized someone important was gone. Her perfume still lingered in the bedroom. A pale gray scarf she forgot hung over the back of the dining chair for nearly 2 weeks before I finally moved it. Even then, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. At 39 years old, I had imagined my life very differently. I thought I would have children by then. A small house somewhere outside Chicago. Weekend barbecues. Family road trips in the summer. Instead, I sat alone in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat while overdue electric bills collected on the kitchen counter beside me. Claire used to say I was too comfortable being average. She hated that I worked as a project manager for a small construction company instead of chasing bigger money in corporate real estate like Ethan Sterling. Ethan had everything people notice first. The custom suits, the imported cars, the lakefront penthouse, the expensive watches that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. Claire noticed all of it immediately. Looking back now, maybe she had been drifting away from me long before she actually left. Maybe I just refused to see it because loving someone for over a decade teaches you how to ignore uncomfortable truths. The final months of our marriage were filled with tiny silences. Claire stopped asking how my day went. She barely touched her dinner when we ate together. At night, she lay beside me scrolling through photos of luxury vacations and beachfront resorts while I stared at the ceiling pretending not to notice how far apart we had become even while sharing the same bed. The night she left, she didn't scream. That somehow made it hurt worse. She simply looked tired. Tired of me. Tired of our life. Tired of waiting for a future she no longer believed in. Ethan can give me the life I deserve, she said quietly near the door. I'm sorry, Daniel, but I want more. I remember nodding slowly like I understood. Maybe part of me did. I signed the divorce papers 2 months later in a quiet office downtown. Claire barely looked at me during the meeting. Ethan waited outside in a black Mercedes while she adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist. I noticed she wore white that day. Claire always wore white when she wanted to look untouched by consequences. When the lawyer finished explaining the paperwork, Claire finally glanced at me and said something I never forgot. You're a good man, Daniel. Just not the man I need anymore. I smiled politely. Then I signed my name. That night, I returned to the apartment alone. I heated leftover soup in the microwave, sat at the kitchen table, and listened to the refrigerator hum in the silence. Somewhere across the city, my ex-wife was beginning her glamorous new life beside a wealthy man. And everyone who knew us probably assumed my story had ended there. They were wrong. The first winter after the divorce was the hardest season of my life. Chicago looked colder than I remembered. The sidewalks turned gray beneath layers of dirty snow, and the wind coming off Lake Michigan cut through my coat every morning while I walked 3 blocks to the train station. I used to hate those walks because they reminded me how far my life had fallen behind everyone else around me. Men my age were buying vacation homes in Florida. They were posting family photos beside swimming pools and boats and college graduations. Meanwhile, I spent most evenings eating microwave dinners alone while trying to ignore the silence waiting for me inside the apartment. For a while, I avoided social media completely. Every time I opened my phone, I saw another picture of Claire smiling beside Ethan Sterling. Napa Valley, Aspen, Manhattan rooftops glowing at sunset. She looked beautiful in every photo. Relaxed, proud, like she had finally escaped a life she was embarrassed to admit she once belonged to. Friends stopped inviting me out after a few months. Not because they were cruel. Most people just do not know what to do with failure when it sits directly in front of them. Divorced men make people uncomfortable, especially the quiet ones. One Friday night, my former coworker Greg invited me to a birthday dinner downtown. Halfway through the meal, his wife leaned across the table and asked carefully, "Have you heard from Claire lately?" The entire table went silent after that. I remember smiling politely and shaking my head before taking another sip of water. Nobody knew where to look. That was the moment I realized people were not seeing me as Daniel anymore. I had become the man whose wife left him for someone richer. That was my identity now. I stopped feeling angry after a while. Exhaustion replaced it. Real exhaustion. The kind that settles into your bones after too many sleepless nights replaying old conversations in your head. Some nights I stayed awake until 2 in the morning wondering what exactly Ethan had that I did not. More money, obviously. Better connections. Better suits. But deep down, I knew that was not the real answer. Claire did not leave because I was cruel. She left because I made her feel ordinary. Stable. Predictable. And in a world obsessed with status, ordinary can start to feel invisible. Around that time, the construction company where I worked announced layoffs. The owner called me into his office one Tuesday afternoon and explained that rising costs had forced them to cut management positions. He looked genuinely sorry while he spoke. I appreciated that. Some people cannot even offer kindness when delivering bad news. I packed my desk into a cardboard box and carried it to the train station during rush hour, surrounded by strangers rushing toward lives that still seemed to have direction. I remember standing on the platform staring at my reflection in the dark train window. My hair had more gray in it than I realized. My shoulders looked heavier, older, defeated. When I got home that night, I sat in the apartment without turning on the lights. The city glowed faintly through the blinds while traffic moved below the windows. For the first time in my life, I truly understood how loneliness could become dangerous if you let it settle in too deeply. Then something small happened. Nothing dramatic. No inspirational movie moment. I opened the refrigerator and realized I had been surviving on frozen meals and takeout for almost 6 months. That realization embarrassed me more than losing my marriage. So the next morning, I cleaned the kitchen. I went grocery shopping. I cooked eggs and toast for breakfast instead of ordering delivery. Then I made my bed. Tiny things. Ordinary things. But for the first time in months, I felt like I had participated in my own life instead of merely surviving it. I did not know it then, but that was where everything quietly began to change. The routine saved me before ambition ever did. Every morning, I woke up at 6:30 even though I no longer had an office to report to. I shaved, made coffee, opened the blinds, forced myself to move like a man whose life still mattered. At first, it felt ridiculous. There were days I sat at the kitchen table in a clean button-down shirt while sending out job applications that nobody answered. But slowly, those mornings stopped feeling fake. They started feeling necessary. One afternoon, I received a call from an old client named Martin Keller. Years earlier, I had supervised a small commercial renovation project for his family-owned hardware chain in the suburbs. He remembered that I had finished the project under budget and without the usual construction delays. "You were one of the few honest managers I ever worked with," he told me over the phone. That sentence stayed with me longer than he probably realized. Martin needed help overseeing repairs on 3 retail properties his company had recently purchased. Temporary contract work. Nothing glamorous. But it paid enough to keep me afloat while I figured out what came next. I accepted immediately. The first few weeks were exhausting. I drove hundreds of miles across Illinois inspecting old buildings, reviewing permits, negotiating with contractors, and solving problems nobody else wanted to deal with. Most nights I came home physically drained, but for the first time in a long while, my mind felt quiet. Pain loses some of its power when your days become too full to constantly revisit old memories. Around that same time, I stopped checking Claire's social media accounts. Not because I no longer cared, but because I finally understood that watching someone else live the life you wanted only poisons your ability to rebuild your own. Still, news about her found me anyway. Mutual friends mentioned seeing Claire and Ethan at charity galas downtown. A former coworker told me Ethan had purchased a $30,000 watch during a business trip to Switzerland. Another person mentioned Claire was redecorating Ethan's penthouse with imported Italian furniture. Everyone spoke about them the same way people talk about celebrities. Admiration mixed with curiosity. Meanwhile, I spent most evenings reviewing spreadsheets at my kitchen table while eating grilled chicken and rice from plastic meal containers. Funny enough, I started sleeping better during that period than I had in years. There is something calming about having no illusions left. One rainy Tuesday evening, Martin invited me to dinner after we finished inspecting a shopping center outside Naperville. Halfway through the meal, he looked at me carefully and said, "You know why most people fail after divorce?" I shook my head. Because they spend too much time trying to prove their ex wrong instead of rebuilding themselves. I thought about that sentence for days afterward. Deep down, I knew part of me still wanted Claire to regret leaving. I wanted her to see me become successful. I wanted her to feel shocked by what she lost. But eventually, another realization replaced that bitterness. If my entire recovery depended on making someone else sorry, then I was still giving them control over my life. That realization changed something inside me. I stopped thinking about revenge entirely. Instead, I focused on becoming stable again, strong again, disciplined again. Over the next year, Martin trusted me with larger projects, then larger budgets, then investment opportunities. He taught me things nobody had ever explained before about commercial property, long-term assets, and how wealth quietly grows when people stop chasing appearances and start understanding patience. I listened carefully. I learned everything I could. While Ethan Sterling spent money showing the world how rich he was, I spent my evenings studying contracts, market reports, and financing structures at a scratched wooden table inside a small apartment above a laundromat. Most people would have looked at my life and seen nothing impressive at all. But for the first time in years, I no longer felt embarrassed by the man staring back at me in the mirror. By the second year after the divorce, my life no longer looked like something people pitied. It still was not glamorous. I was not driving luxury cars or vacationing in the south of France like the people Claire used to admire online. But the constant pressure in my chest had finally disappeared. I rented a better apartment on the north side of Chicago with large windows overlooking a quiet tree-lined street. Every morning, sunlight filled the kitchen while I drank coffee and reviewed project reports before work. Small things began to feel meaningful again. Clean sheets, a stocked refrigerator, fresh air coming through open windows on cool spring mornings. Peace has a strange way of making ordinary moments feel expensive after chaos finally leaves your life. Martin eventually invited me to become a minority partner in several commercial property investments. The first time he mentioned it, I honestly thought he was joking. Men like Martin usually invested with people who already had money, not divorced project managers rebuilding their lives in their 40s. But he trusted consistency more than charm. "You show up," he told me one afternoon while we walked through a newly renovated retail plaza. Most people underestimate how rare that actually is. I invested carefully, conservatively. No flashy risks. No desperate attempts to become rich overnight. The opposite of Ethan Sterling, from what I heard. Ethan loved attention. Every business magazine in Chicago seemed to feature him at some point. New developments, luxury hotels, exclusive rooftop parties. His name appeared everywhere. Mine appeared nowhere. And I preferred it that way. One evening, I attended a networking dinner hosted by a real estate association downtown. I almost skipped it because events like that used to make me uncomfortable. Rooms full of expensive suits and rehearsed confidence always reminded me of everything Claire believed I lacked. But that night turned out differently than I expected. People listened when I spoke. They respected my opinions about construction costs and property management. One investor even asked if I would consult on a development project outside Milwaukee. Driving home afterward, I realized something quietly important. For years, I had viewed myself through Claire's disappointment instead of my own reality. That distortion had followed me long after the marriage ended. But slowly, it was fading. Around that same time, I heard rumors that Ethan's business empire was becoming unstable. Delayed payments, failed acquisitions, investors quietly pulling out of projects. At first, I ignored the gossip. Wealthy people always seemed surrounded by rumors. But then Martin mentioned Ethan during lunch one afternoon. "He expanded too fast," he said calmly while cutting into his steak. "Men like him think momentum lasts forever." I nodded without saying much. Honestly, I did not care enough anymore to celebrate another man's problems. That surprised me. There was a time when hearing bad news about Ethan would have felt deeply satisfying. Instead, I mostly felt distant from the entire chapter of my old life. Claire rarely crossed my mind by then. Occasionally, I would see her name tagged in photos online through mutual acquaintances. Her smile looked tighter than before, more rehearsed. The comments beneath the photos remained full of admiration, but something in her eyes had changed. I noticed it immediately because I had once spent 11 years learning every expression she made, without realizing I was memorizing them. One Friday evening, I returned home after signing contracts for a new commercial development partnership in suburban Illinois. It was easily the biggest opportunity of my career. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and stood near the apartment window watching traffic move below while jazz music played softly from the kitchen speaker. No celebration, no dramatic moment, just quiet satisfaction. My phone buzzed against the counter around 9:30 that night. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then another message appeared immediately afterward. Daniel, I know it has been a long time, but I really need to talk to you. The moment I read Claire's name beneath the message, the entire room suddenly felt very still. I stared at Claire's message for nearly a full minute before responding. Not because I was emotional. Surprisingly, I was not. What unsettled me was how distant her name suddenly felt after once being the center of my entire life. 3 years earlier, a single text from her could ruin my entire day. Now I looked at the screen with the same calm detachment I might feel reading an email from someone I used to work with years ago. I finally typed 4 simple words. What do you need, Claire? Her reply came almost immediately. Can we meet tomorrow? I considered saying no. Honestly, part of me believed reopening old doors only invited old pain back inside. But another part of me felt curious. Not hopeful, not bitter, just curious. So the following evening, I met her at a quiet restaurant near the river downtown. The kind of place professionals visited after work for expensive cocktails and polite conversations. Claire used to love places like that. I arrived first, ordered sparkling water, waited calmly while soft piano music drifted through the restaurant. When Claire finally walked in, I barely recognized her at first. She was still beautiful, of course. Some people carry elegance naturally no matter what life does to them. But the sharp confidence she once wore so effortlessly had faded. Her shoulders looked tense beneath her beige coat. The dark circles under her eyes were hidden carefully beneath makeup, but not well enough to disappear completely. She smiled nervously when she saw me standing near the table. Daniel, she said softly. I nodded politely and pulled out the chair across from me. For the first few minutes, the conversation stayed painfully formal. Weather, traffic, work, the kind of meaningless small talk people use when they are terrified of the real conversation waiting underneath. Then Claire finally looked down at her untouched glass of wine and exhaled slowly. Ethan is in serious trouble, she admitted quietly. I did not react. She continued speaking before I even had time to answer. Several of Ethan's developments had collapsed financially over the past year. Investors sued him. Banks froze major accounts connected to ongoing investigations. Articles about his business practices began appearing online almost weekly. The glamorous world Claire once stepped into so proudly had apparently started falling apart long before outsiders noticed. Everything changed, she whispered. The party stopped. The trip stopped. People disappeared. I listened silently while traffic lights reflected against the restaurant windows beside us. Claire twisted the ring on her finger nervously while speaking. I noticed she no longer wore expensive jewelry. No designer handbag rested beside her chair either. Tiny details. But after 11 years together, I had learned how to notice what people lose before they admit it aloud. Ethan blames everyone except himself, she continued. He barely comes home anymore. I nodded once. Still calm. Still quiet. Claire studied my face carefully like she expected anger or satisfaction and could not understand why neither appeared. You seem different, she finally said. I am different, I answered honestly. That was the moment the conversation shifted. Claire looked at me the same way people look at a hometown after returning years later and realizing everything familiar somehow changed without them noticing. The truth was simple. She remembered the version of me who felt small beside wealthier men. The version who doubted himself constantly. The version who measured his worth through someone else's approval. That man no longer existed. Dinner arrived, but Claire barely touched her food. She kept glancing at me between long silences like she was searching for traces of the husband she once left behind. Finally, after nearly an hour of conversation, she lowered her eyes and asked the question I think she had rehearsed all day. Daniel, have you ever hated me for leaving? I looked out the window toward the river glowing beneath the city lights before answering quietly. For a while, I hated myself more than I hated you. Claire's expression collapsed the moment she heard those words. Claire stared at the table for several seconds after I answered her question. The noise of the restaurant continued around us. Glasses clinked softly. Waiters moved between tables carrying expensive steaks and bottles of wine. Somewhere near the bar, a group of businessmen laughed too loudly at something that probably was not funny. But at our table, everything felt strangely quiet. Claire folded her hands together carefully, like she was trying to stop them from shaking. "I did not realize how unhappy you were," she said softly. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, because it revealed how differently two people can experience the same marriage. "That is the thing about slow loneliness," I replied calmly. "It does not usually announce itself." Claire lowered her eyes again. I could see guilt settling over her in waves now that the distractions surrounding her life had started disappearing. Wealth has a way of muting uncomfortable truths. Luxury can make people believe they are happy simply because their surroundings look impressive. But eventually, silence catches up with everyone. Claire admitted that things with Ethan had begun changing less than a year after she moved into his penthouse. At first, there were still parties and vacations and expensive dinners beside the lake. But over time, Ethan became colder, more distracted, more controlling about money. He stopped treating Claire like a partner and started treating her like an accessory connected to a lifestyle he could barely maintain anymore. "I kept telling myself things would get better," she whispered. I did not want to admit I made a mistake. I listened quietly because I understood that feeling better than she probably realized. Pride traps people inside failing situations long after common sense tells them to leave. I had done the same thing during the final years of our marriage. Claire explained that Ethan's financial problems became impossible to ignore after several lawsuits hit local news outlets. Investors backed out. Employees resigned. Friends who once crowded around them at events suddenly stopped returning calls. "People disappear fast when the money disappears," she said bitterly. That sentence stayed with me because I remembered feeling abandoned too after the divorce. Different circumstances. Same loneliness. The waiter arrived to clear our plates, but neither of us had eaten much. Claire wrapped both hands around her wine glass, even though she barely drank from it. Then she finally asked the question I knew had been sitting underneath everything else all evening. "Are you seeing someone?" I answered honestly. No, something unreadable crossed her face after that. Relief mixed with sadness. Maybe even regret. "You always deserved someone loyal," she said quietly. Years earlier, hearing those words would have reopened every wound I carried. But now they landed differently, like echoes from a life that no longer belonged to me. I studied Claire carefully across the table. For the first time since our divorce, I stopped seeing the woman who hurt me and started seeing someone deeply exhausted by her own choices. There was no triumph in that realization. No revenge. Just perspective. Toward the end of dinner, Claire finally admitted why she truly contacted me. Ethan had recently left Chicago for weeks at a time, dealing with legal and financial issues in other states. Their relationship was effectively over even if nobody had officially admitted it yet. Claire's lease on a luxury condo connected to one of Ethan's companies was ending soon, and she had no idea what came next. "I know I probably do not deserve your kindness," she said carefully while staring down at the tablecloth. "But talking to you tonight reminded me what it felt like to sit beside someone who actually cared about me as a person." I remained silent for several moments after she said that. 3 years earlier, I would have interpreted those words as hope, maybe even love returning. But maturity changes the way pain sounds when it comes back wearing familiar faces. I paid the dinner bill before Claire could argue. Outside, cold wind moved through the streets while downtown Chicago glowed around us beneath the dark sky. Claire stood beside me on the sidewalk, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "Thank you for meeting me," she said softly. Then, after a long pause, she added something that nearly disappeared beneath the noise of passing traffic. "Leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life." I looked at her quietly for a moment before answering in the calmest voice I had used all evening. "No, Claire. Losing yourself was." After that dinner, Claire started appearing in my life again in small, careful ways. A text message every few days. A short phone call asking how work was going. Once, she sent me a picture of the lake at sunrise because she remembered I used to wake up early on weekends just to drink coffee beside the water. None of it felt manipulative. If anything, she sounded uncertain all the time now, like someone slowly learning how fragile life becomes after losing the identity they built around appearances. I stayed polite but cautious. There is a difference between forgiveness and reopening a wound that finally healed correctly. One Saturday morning in early October, Claire called unexpectedly while I was reviewing contracts at my kitchen counter. Her voice sounded strained. "I am sorry to bother you," she said quietly, "but my car will not start, and I honestly do not know who else to call." For a second, I almost laughed at the irony. Years earlier, Claire would have called Ethan for something like that without hesitation. Now she was standing alone in a parking garage asking the man she once abandoned for help. I drove downtown anyway. The weather had turned colder again, and dry leaves scraped across the sidewalks while people hurried through the city carrying coffee cups and briefcases. When I pulled into the garage, I found Claire, standing beside a dark gray sedan, wearing a long camel-colored coat with both hands shoved into her pockets to stay warm. She looked relieved when she saw me. Not glamorous, not polished, just relieved. I opened the hood, checked the battery connection, and realized the problem was minor. 10 minutes later, the engine started normally again. Claire let out a small breath and smiled at me in a way I had not seen in years. Genuine, unrehearsed. "You always knew how to fix things," she said softly. The strange part was that I no longer heard that sentence the same way I once would have. Back then, I would have mistaken moments like that for proof she still loved me. But age teaches you that nostalgia can sound dangerously similar to love if you are lonely enough. Claire asked if I wanted coffee afterward, and against my better judgment, I agreed. We found a small cafe near the river with steamed-up windows and old jazz music playing quietly in the background. As we sat there drinking coffee while cold rain tapped against the glass outside, Claire began talking more honestly than she ever had during our marriage. She admitted she spent years chasing environments that looked successful instead of relationships that actually felt safe. "I thought excitement meant happiness," she said while staring down into her cup. I confused attention with love. I listened without interrupting. There was no reason to punish her anymore. Life had already done enough of that on its own. Claire explained that after Ethan's financial collapse became public, many of the people surrounding them disappeared almost overnight. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends stopped calling. Even family members became distant once the image of wealth started cracking apart. "I used to think people admired us," she admitted bitterly. "Now I realize most of them only admired access." That sentence stayed with me because it explained something much larger than our marriage. Entire lives can collapse when they are built around impressing strangers instead of protecting peace. Before we left the cafe, Claire looked at me carefully across the table and asked a question so quietly I almost missed it. "Do you think people deserve second chances?" I leaned back slowly in my chair before answering. "I think some people deserve the opportunity to become different than who they used to be." Claire's eyes watered slightly after hearing that, but she quickly looked away toward the rain outside the window. On the drive home later that night, I realized something uncomfortable. Seeing Claire again no longer filled me with pain, but it also no longer filled me with certainty. The love I once carried for her had changed into something quieter now, something older, more careful, and for the first time since our marriage ended, I could not tell whether that frightened me or finally set me free. Winter arrived early that year. Chicago streets disappeared beneath gray slush and freezing rain, while people rushed through downtown with scarves wrapped tightly around their faces. By then, Claire and I had settled into something neither of us fully understood. We were not together again, but we were no longer strangers either. Sometimes we had dinner after work. Sometimes she called late at night when anxiety kept her awake. And sometimes we sat quietly beside each other without discussing the past at all. Oddly enough, those silent moments felt more honest than most conversations we used to have during our marriage. One evening in December, Claire came to my apartment for dinner. It was the first time she had been inside my new place. She moved slowly through the living room while snow drifted outside the windows overlooking the street below. "This feels peaceful," she said softly while looking around. I knew what she really meant. There was no chaos here, no performance, no pressure to impress anyone. Just warm lighting, jazz music playing quietly in the background, and the smell of rosemary chicken cooking in the oven. The kind of life Claire once believed was too ordinary to satisfy her. We ate at the kitchen table while soft snow covered the city outside. At one point, Claire looked at me carefully across the candlelight and smiled faintly. "You seem happier than I ever remember you being." I thought about that for a moment before answering honestly. I think I finally stopped. trying to become someone else. Claire lowered her eyes after hearing that. The silence between us stretched comfortably for several seconds. Then, quietly, she said the words I think she had been carrying for months. I never should have left you. I did not respond immediately. The old version of me would have clung to that sentence desperately, treated it like victory, proof that I had finally become enough. But now it felt different, sadder somehow, because no apology can return the years people lose while trying to become worthy in someone else's eyes. Claire continued speaking before I answered. She admitted she spent most of her relationship with Ethan trying to maintain an image that constantly exhausted her. The expensive dinners, luxury vacations, designer clothes, social events. None of it actually made her feel secure. It only distracted her temporarily from deeper unhappiness she never addressed. I kept thinking the next trip or the next house or the next party would finally make me feel complete, she whispered. But I just kept feeling emptier. Outside the windows, snow continued falling silently over the city while headlights moved slowly below through the storm. Claire stared down at her wine glass for a long moment before finally looking back at me again. Her eyes filled with tears almost immediately. Daniel, I miss us, she admitted softly. I miss who we were before everything became about money and status and proving things to people who never really cared. Hearing that hurt more than I expected, not because I wanted revenge, but because part of me remembered exactly what she meant. There really had been a time when we were happy with simple things. Cheap furniture, weekend grocery shopping together, long drives with no destination. Somewhere along the way, ambition poisoned gratitude inside our marriage without either of us noticing until it was too late. Claire reached across the table carefully and rested her hand near mine. I know I do not deserve another chance, she whispered through tears. But if there is even a small part of you that still believes in us, I would spend the rest of my life trying to make things right. The apartment became completely silent after that. I looked at Claire sitting across from me beneath the warm kitchen light while snow covered the windows behind her. 3 years earlier, hearing those words would have felt like salvation. Now they felt like responsibility. Heavy, complicated, dangerous. Because rebuilding trust is not the same as rebuilding attraction. And forgiveness is not always permission to return. I stood slowly from the table and walked toward the window overlooking the snowy street below. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I finally turned back toward her and answered in the calmest voice I could manage. The hardest part is that I already forgave you a long time ago, Claire. I just do not know if I can survive loving you the same way twice. Claire stayed at the apartment for another hour after I answered her. Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us tried to force the conversation somewhere dramatic. We simply sat there listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, while snow continued falling against the windows. Eventually, Claire wiped her eyes carefully and gave me a sad smile that looked both grateful and heartbroken at the same time. I understand, she whispered. More than you probably think. I walked her downstairs a little after midnight. The streets were almost empty except for taxis moving slowly through the snow-covered intersections downtown. Claire stood beside the curb, pulling her coat tightly around herself while cold air drifted between us. For a moment, she looked exactly like the woman I first fell in love with years ago. Not because of beauty, because of vulnerability. Real vulnerability. The kind people spend entire lives hiding behind money, success, and appearances. Daniel, she said quietly before the car arrived, if you never let me back into your life completely, I still want you to know meeting you again saved me in a way I cannot explain. I nodded slowly but did not answer immediately. The truth was, seeing Claire again had changed me too. Not by reopening old wounds. By proving they had actually healed. 3 years earlier, her approval still determined my sense of worth. Now I could stand in front of her without anger, desperation, or fear. That realization mattered more than reconciliation ever could. Her rideshare pulled up beside the curb moments later. Claire opened the door, then paused before getting inside. I really did love you, she whispered softly. I just lost myself chasing things that did not matter. Then she disappeared into the car, and the taillights faded slowly into the falling snow. I stood there for several seconds after she left, hands in my coat pockets, breathing cold winter air while the city glowed quietly around me. Oddly enough, I did not feel lonely. A few weeks later, Martin invited me to join him at the opening ceremony for a newly completed commercial property development outside Chicago. It was one of the largest projects I had ever helped oversee. Investors, city officials, and business leaders filled the building, exchanging handshakes beneath bright lights and expensive decorations. At one point during the evening, Martin handed me a glass of sparkling water and smiled. "You know," he said casually, "a few years ago you walked into my office looking like a man who had completely given up on himself." I laughed softly. "That obvious?" "Only to people who have been there before," he answered. That sentence stayed with me the entire drive home later that night. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped measuring success through other people's admiration. The expensive lifestyle Claire once chased no longer impressed me the way it used to. Real success felt quieter than that. It looked like sleeping peacefully at night, like building a life that did not require pretending, like becoming someone whose happiness no longer depended on proving anything to the people who underestimated him. About a month after Christmas, Claire sent me one final message. "Thank you for showing me kindness when I deserved resentment." I stared at the words for a long moment before replying honestly. We were both lost for a while. She responded with a small heart emoji after that. Nothing more. And strangely, that felt like the correct ending for us. Not a dramatic reunion. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Just two people finally understanding each other too late to return to who they once were. Spring arrived slowly after that. Snow melted from the sidewalks. Outdoor cafes reopened along the river. One Sunday morning, I sat alone on my apartment balcony drinking coffee while sunlight warmed the buildings across the street. My phone remained silent beside me. No chaos. No confusion. No desperate need to be chosen by someone else anymore. And for the first time in my adult life, peace no longer felt temporary. It felt earned. Looking back now, I think some people enter your life to love you. Others enter your life to break you apart so you can finally rebuild yourself correctly. Claire did both. And maybe that is why, despite everything that happened between us, I no longer remember her as the woman who destroyed my life. I remember her as the woman whose leaving forced me to finally find it.